Good morning. I'm delighted to be here on home turf, home landscape, to talk about this wonderful place we call Toronto. Full disclosure, I'm not a landscape architect. I'm a landscape ecologist, and I'm also a planner. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about the dynamic intersection, the interplay, and the space between landscape and culture, culture and nature. So I hope I can provide some navigation of what it is to be in this landscape from that perspective. So what is this landscape? What is this place we call Toronto? The knowledge of how this landscape was formed offers clues, a lot of important clues to making visible and legible the nuance of place that we've heard about already. Today on this opening panel, Brendan Stewart, my colleagues Brendan and Jane Wolfe, will talk together about this framework for understanding, created a common language, I hope, for a sense of stewardship that is the focus of this conference. When we see a satellite image of Toronto, with which many of you will be familiar, whether through wayfinding or through research or just by looking from space, because we're able to do that now, we see a city that is shaped by its ravines. We see gray infrastructure, we see green infrastructure, and we see blue infrastructure, land and water and buildings. Toronto has been variously described as the city within a park, owing to its more than 1,400 parks, trails, and public gardens that we're going to hear a lot about today. The ravine system is central. It's the spinal cord, it's the skeletal framework. It's also been described, of course, as the accidental city by Robert Fulford, a city that has inadvertently grown up around its ravines. And the city is, I would point out, as much a riverfront as it is a waterfront. The bones of the city are its ravines. We've heard about that already. The streams and valley corridors, the headwaters of the Oak Ridges Moraine right down to Lake Ontario. Lake Ontario, which was described by the first French explorers as les mers douces, the sweetwater seas. They did indeed look like an ocean inland. But they have been for us in Toronto everything from resource-rich to our dumping ground to our front door. And we are reminded every season about their history, the ice age that has formed the Great Lakes, today mere puddles that remain in the wake of glacial retreat. But the forces, the twin forces of erosion and deposition, of accretion and deletion are always at work. And landscape is that intimate relationship between water and land, and in Toronto in particular, between what I like to think of as our blue infrastructure and our green infrastructure of nature. So the lake, the rivers, the wetlands relate to the bluffs, to the islands, to the spit, and we'll hear more about that as we go through this session. Our waterfront, our back door, the ravines, and the lake. When we talk about formation, we need to understand that the processes of observation are different than the business day. We need to slow down and think about the scales of geologic time. Consider, for example, the vast expanse of the Niagara Escarpment from its origins or its point in the Golden Horseshoe to where it terminates in Tobermory several hundred kilometers away, right down to the scale of a boulder, a pebble, the sand under your feet on the beach. Toronto is a till plain. It is a giant space of sand and gravel that has been laid down over 40, 50, 100, 1,000 years or more. In the last ice age, the Wisconsinian ice age, as it's called, those lobes of ice pushed from the southwest. In fact, we can see their footprints if we look just north of the city using a topographic map. We can see the retreat and advance of the glaciers, scratched and scoured out in our Muskoka lakes. We can see that footprint. The Laurentide ice sheet, more than a kilometer thick, pressing, scraping, and scouring out the shape, a familiar shape to many of us. North of the city, when it gets too hot to be on the Toronto waterfront, we retreat to places north, dotted by lakes, familiar footprints from the last ice age. Today, the materials that were pushed forward by that ice are visible. They're visible in the exposed walls of the brickworks quarry. They are, in fact, the ingredients of the bricks and mortar of the city of Toronto. Those glacial deposits are necessary and essential to the city. And the glacial features are also evident at the edge of the bluffs, a remnant shoreline of the last post-glacial lake. The cathedral bluffs in particular bear witness to the shore of the former Lake Iroquois. That's how high that the initial lake was. And as the ice receded, you can see that the compressed land rose like a sponge squeezed and is visible today if we stand at the foot or the top of Casaloma Steps, Brackendale Hill, Hillcrest, Davenport Road, that marks and traces the former Lake Iroquois shoreline. If we fast forward to 1793 and the founding of Toronto, we see that the mouth of the Don River and the heart of what becomes the city is already depicted as a shallow, marshy space. It's not a deep water port yet. What is the character of this place? It was described as lush in wetlands, rich in shorebirds, rivers teeming with fish. Of course, treasures and resources that the indigenous people knew well for centuries. Early colonial artists depicted this landscape. They depicted the lushness, the richness, from timber to minerals, here looking southwest from Ashbridges Bay across the open harbor to the islands. In the background, you can see the first of the cultural landscape being formed by the dredger. This was a landscape rich from timber to minerals, fish and fowl, and sometimes, of course, harsh and unforgiving. The beginning of the industrialization era makes us think that we need to consider the forces of human ingenuity, forces of human engineering, the beginning of design, where Toronto begins its march forward to its present day. We can focus even just for a moment at the mouth of the Don, on the islands, and in the port. The Don River mouth opened at one time, particularly in this map, the Aitken Survey of 1793, to an expansive marsh, which we called Ashbridges Bay. This was bounded not by what we see today, but by a barrier beach that was impressive and expansive. And even as early as the late 18th century, it was well recognized in early engineering drawings and surveys that this was a dynamic place. The islands were described as shifting sands by notations on the survey. Notations that say, this form end of the island is always changing. I can't map it. Or, these islands have washed away in the last 5 years. But by 1884, the islands have grown again. They've been nourished by the Scarborough Bluffs' eroding sands, fed by the Don River sediments, and by the counterclockwise longshore sediment that carries forward and feeds the shape of the islands. By 1894, we start to see a significant change in the shape of the port, marked by engineering, which stabilizes the islands and creates the ship channel. The dock walls become hardened. The edges of the lake become concrete for ship mooring, for port activities, and the inner harbor is dredged and deepened. This is an era of engineering design motivated by flooding. The river's meandering and lazy habit, of course, is no match for economic efficiency. The continual and dynamic processes of nature, of erosion and deposition, give rise to rather dramatic landscape effects that are deemed not useful for the current city. Upstream flooding is a problem, and so plans to straighten and channelize the Don are put in place. In 1888, the Don begins its straightening journey. From 1818 to 1911, we see significant marked changes to the structure of the river mouth, the harbor shape, and the island's form. We wouldn't recognize today what is depicted in these earlier surveys. By 1913, the dredging and deepening and straightening has stabilized the port, closer to what we see today, but still not quite there. 1912 to 1913 marks a transition and a significant moment in the evolution of Toronto's landscape, beginning with the front door and looking upstream. Its relationship between river and lake, water and land changes fundamentally. And this is the beginning of changes to two key landscape shaping forces that continue today but are altered because of our designs. We have a change in the downstream sediment that flows down the Don, and a change in the longshore currents that nourish the sands of the islands. These counterclockwise currents have been interrupted. And they've been changed fundamentally by lake filling, the activity, the human processes of engineered land making, not only reclaiming places, but making land. As the city grows, the excavated material from the downtown towers builds land in the port. You can see here in this image that the green natural shoreline prior to the 1850s, and in blue, the designed engineered landscape of lake filling that is the modern day port. The effect, of course, is the interruption of natural processes of sedimentation and erosion. And today, we've actually reversed the outflow. The mouth of the Don flows now west instead of east into the inner bay. And by the early 20th century, our industrial landscape is dominant. It's what we recognize today, although I think the photographs might be a little bit more compelling, particularly those that we see in the new era of modernization. There are further changes, of course, to the port, but also to the upstream landscapes that are affected by this. The watersheds of the Humber and the Don now frame the center of the city. The Don, Canada's largest urban watershed at 365 square kilometers, flows south from its headwaters, its points of origin, the bubbling streams and creeks of the Oak Ridges Moraine, filtered by its glacial sand and gravels. That port has now changed, though. We don't have a very vast lakefront marsh, but we do have a very efficient port, a port that's no longer needed because our manufacturing sector has changed. We now have a different use for that land, and we'll hear a lot about that this afternoon, and different set of values that go along with it. As we continue to look at these changes, we now see not only changes to the mouth of the Don and its shape, but the emergence of a new landform entirely as a result of lake filling. The continuing process of filling creates a Leslie Street spit from the 1960s forward to today. This is a magnificent 5-kilometer headland that is created essentially from the detritus of design. It's a new waterfront landscape, relatively speaking, in its own right. It is part of the accidental city legacy and one of the incredible unintended consequences that have created an urban wilderness, a new park, Tommy Thompson Park, a major bird observatory and one of the most significant on the North American flyway. And so now, the Don River, channelized, straightened, fortified, marks a different kind of gateway to a port that's in disuse, a doorstep to a city that has a different set of values. It still makes that right-angle turn, and yet the river's still flooded. Even after the straightening, 1920s, 1930s, floods continued, and they were significant. They were most significant for that century on October 16th of 1954, when Hurricane Hazel landed in Toronto, that pivotal event that dropped 280 millimeters of rain in 12 hours, created unprecedented destruction. Some would call it creative destruction. Again, the unintended consequence was the protection of a ravine system that matured and grew into the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, charged with the protection of those corridors, that infrastructural green backbone of the city, and the birth and beginning of our natural heritage system. Today's Don Valley looking south is still channelized, but we see a difference now. We see a softening of the edges. A green edge is reemerging from the concrete. But yet at its outflow, it's subsumed by the armature of the Gardiner Expressway and the DVP, straitjacketed in concrete, the city's drain. And in 2005, you might remember this as the day that the remnants of Hurricane Katrina landed on our doorstep. We're reminded once again of the dynamic force of water. It may be out of sight, but it emerges into plain view when enough of it falls and our infrastructure is crumbling. And more recently, in 2013, we had another major storm, and another after that, and still another, this one dumping 123 millimeters of rain in 2 hours, most of it during rush hour. But something different happened. Some places along the watershed were designed to flood. They expected the flooding. They were a little overwhelmed by that volume as their first big flood, but Evergreen Brickworks, for example, which experienced about a meter of water, learned a lot from that cleanup, and I think is still learning. Most importantly, this signals a change in the era of values, of remediation and conservation, a way of doing things differently. We now have a green belt of 1.8 million acres protected around the city for food, for farming, and for water, a cultural landscape in its own right. It is the source of Toronto's drinking water. It feeds our connected system, our magnificent connection of more than 1,400 parks, public gardens, and ravines that are the bones of the city. We celebrate it in our artwork now. We've turned to face that water again. We're revealing the city's natural landscape in ways that we hadn't thought to do for the previous 100 years. And this is an incredible era for us because it speaks to the role of design. We're entering a time when we might think of ourselves as finally being parks positive. We have more than a dozen programs, policies, and plans all put in place within the last 5 years, from green roofs to municipal biodiversity plans, to urban forest management plans, and to parks plans. From the Lake Ontario Park, Canada's largest urban wilderness, to Tommy Thompson Park, and to the establishment of a continuous greenway from waterfront Toronto up to the headwaters in the Oak Ridges Moraine, a complete natural heritage system which we are working towards, connecting these former islands of green. We can finally say we are the city within a park. But it begs an important question. This is a dynamic and continuously evolving landscape. It is a hybrid of culture and nature in no uncertain terms. I didn't speak about the natural components of that natural heritage, just its formation, but I assure you they look nothing like the nature of 100 years ago. Are they any less valuable? As what we call nature disappears from under our feet, the parts that remain become exceptionally important to us. We might navigate that question more skillfully than we have in the past, asking whose nature is represented, whose landscape and the decisions that we make count. Land becomes more precious when population grows. Our parks, too, our public landscapes must evolve and change. It is an essential conversation that we start today of how to embrace change in ways that will protect and steward those places that define us. And the role of design, I submit, is paramount. My colleagues will speak more of this, and they are more professionally capable than I am, but I will submit that navigating that collaborative conversation is one of the most important roles for design.